So just as a review here, just very quickly, and I want to talk about the obvious and be very brief as I mentioned. But, you know, the Tonto is looking at all the variety of the diversity of ecosystems here on the Tonto National Forest. It just really begs the question, where do you start? How do you approach hundreds of thousands of acres to understand how to frame decisions and go forward? Well, as we take a look at forest ecosystems and the role of fire in those ecosystems here in Arizona, we collectively take a look at three different areas. You know, the ecosystem dynamics of structure, composition, and function. To really understand the structure is what's there. What type of vegetation? How is it placed on the landscape? What's the diversity of that particular component? The composition, the different types of species, the forests, the grasses, the understory, if you will, underneath the higher vegetation, and certainly the function, the relationships of all of the components of the ecosystem. And to understand how all these fit together and work together. Certainly there's historic indicators. And I want to just address for a few minutes the aspect of why it's important to have a historical framework in looking currently at what exists in these ecosystems today and how to go forward, in what direction to go forward. And then I want to talk just very briefly about options for the future of dealing with this. As we take a look at the historic evidence, we know as we go back, say 100 to 150 years, there were a variety of factors that have changed dramatically in many of these ecosystems today. And I'm not going to go down through this, you can just read through those, that certainly these were ecosystems that depended on fire. They were fire dependent. They reacted significantly to fire. They depended on fire for sustainability and resiliency and health. We know that particularly in Ponderosa pine and many of the woodland ecosystems, there were just a few trees per acre, anywhere from 15 to about 50 or 60 trees per acre. Today, and I'll show some comparisons here very quickly, the grasses and forests were abundant, the riparian systems were functioning. What changed and what happened? Well, primarily there were natural processes that happened, and certainly human intervention made a big impact to most of these ecosystems. Human influences, when we talk about pre-settlement, that's generally in this part of the state, in the Southwest, prior to 1870. 1870 is when primarily the European settlement and homesteading and the influx of inhabitants in this part of the world. Humans played a tremendous impact for the last 150 years on these ecosystems. That's when the fires started to be suppressed. Natural fires from lightning were very common, very frequent in most of these ecosystems. And certainly grazing, and when I say intensive grazing, not necessarily every place in the forest, but it was enough to break up the fine fuels, the grasses that would carry fire in these natural ecosystems. And certainly, as changes happened in the ecosystems, they became very dynamic. They started to react in the different components and even off-site, out of particular watersheds or landscapes or ecosystems. So the changes that happened, and again, I'm just going to reference this. If you could just kind of take a look at these components. The structure today, what's the change? Well, we know that we've gone from a few dozen trees primarily to many thousands of trees in some acres, depending on the species, depending on the location. Spatial patterns are different. The trees are located not in groups or in historic mosaic composition that they were, but all of those interspaces between these groups are primarily filled in with regeneration, and certainly that really contributes to the fuel and the fire component that I'll talk about here in just a minute. The composition has changed. Many of the stands, for example, or on top of the Mogollon Rim, or going up the face of the rim, were Ponderosa pine. Because of these disturbances that happen, either taking fire out of the ecosystems, grazing, or sun extraction, timber harvest, that many of these mixed conifer systems have evolved into mixed conifer from Ponderosa pine. It's a very interesting and dynamic concept that I really don't have time to delve into tonight, but I just wanted to bring that up. Many of the native species have been lost in some of these ecosystems. Invasive species and exotic species have been introduced, and certainly the function has changed. We know riparian systems, springs, and streams have changed dramatically over the last 100 years. So I wanted to show a series of a couple of pictures. Now I'm going to sit down so we can move on to some of the presentations. These are just pictures around just on top of the rim to show what I'm talking about here, the dynamic change of some of these ecosystems. Certainly here in 1909, a very open forest on top of the rim, interspaces, a lot of grasses, a lot of very different habitat and ecosystem function than we have in many of these areas today. By 1938, because of the lack of fire suppression and grazing, some timber harvest was happening. Regeneration came in and filled in many of these interspaces. And then this is the same site, same photo point in 1992, that many thousands of trees per acre exist. Just another example here of a study plot up here on the rim. This was Northwood, Afghanistan, where Dr. Woolsey put in a series of study plots over 100 years ago. Now, this particular plot we're looking at, is very interesting. This one, primarily, well, anyway, that's a 145-year-old plot that shows a significant difference in stocking in the streets. Particularly this one here, where this is the same photo. Those green circles you can see them are stumps that are historic indicators on that side. So you can see that particular meadow completely filled in from stock. This is another one, just up here on top of the rim, moreover, just north of the pine strawberry, where plot was put in back in, it's a 109-year-old plot. And the red circles here are what we call historic indicators. These are stumps, logs, physical things that were there that we can go back and study and see what happened with fire and with those ecosystem functions. Upwards of 700 or 800 years. There's Ponderosa pine upon the rim that are approaching 750 years old. So we have a lot of historic evidence to base that on. So if you could just watch this picture as I go from a 100-year difference on the same photo point. That's what happened to that particular site. Without fire and without management. All of the interspace filled in. Same in many of the woodland ecosystems. The top picture there was in 1868. The bottom was 1990. So with human intervention, with lack of fire, these ecosystems change. So this is what this forest plan approach is to really frame the science, understand what's happening in these ecosystems, and then put these areas or continue on a trajectory to meeting objectives. Those objectives are going to vary based on what the fire regime is, based on what the management objectives are. This particular, I just want to point this out, historically, I apologize. It's just not. But basically, the historic fire regime is on the left there, where the fire continued about every 5 to 12 years to clean up the fuels on the ground and also reduce the regeneration. So it would be in a very cyclic, constructive, reconstructive cycle. where fire is taken out, such as on the right-hand side of the slide here, you see that within one decade or 10 to 20 years, those interspaces will fill in, and we have significant fuel and fire hazard on those particular areas. So, in the interest of time here, I'm just going to hold off or stop right here, and we can talk more. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to kind of talk about the significance of what changes have happened and what the forest will be dealing with, and looking at the framework, looking at science and how to weigh science in with that decision process. Because certainly the science and the information that we have, not only we, but the scientists have brought forward, is not to go back and restore every acre out there to pre-settlement conditions, but to understand those concepts so that informed decisions could be made by, the forest supervisor and the planning team as they go forward. So with that,